Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming, visiting us tonight on this rainy day in London. My name is Tate Vincent, I'm the director of the Hungarian Culture Center in London, and you are one of the first ones to enjoy this new space that we have purchased in March. We moved in March, and we have had a couple of events so far, but I'm especially happy to have this event tonight because we have been working together with Inside and Outside the Festival for over 2 years, I believe. And the main idea between the festival, organized by Monica in the first row, you will hear more about her in a little bit. But the main idea is to project and display those who had to flee Hungary as well as other Nazi-occupied countries in the 30s and the 20s and made a huge impact on the art and culture of Great Britain, London, and the area. So we have explored so many great stories with the help of Insiders, Outsiders, and Monica. And I should also recognize Robert Waterhouse, who is not here tonight, but he wrote a spectacular book on all these stories and all these immigrants coming from Hungary or other parts of the world who influenced British life and culture so far. So this is this is going to be a friendly discussion tonight. Each of our panelists will be introduced by Monica, and each of them will tell a little bit about their connection with Ervin Bossányi, whose work is mostly known for the Canterbury Cathedral and the Tate Museum's beautiful stained glass window. And after that, we will have time for questions, as well as once the official part is over, you are welcome to stick around and meet and just have a friendly discussion and ask questions and just enjoy your time here. So without wasting any more of this precious time, I give the floor to Monica and her guests. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Matty. Do I need a microphone? I suspect not. No? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, he's used to projecting, but just to make sure. Yeah. I'm not going to start singing, I promise you. Good. Well, as the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project, it's my very great pleasure to add my words of welcome to those of Matej, the director of the Hungarian Cultural Center. If I may just begin by saying a few words about my project, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, by way of sort of context for this event, and indeed for the whole point of doing this tribute event to Bossányi. Insiders Outsiders was a small idea I had, I think it was in late 2017, that it was time to look in a more comprehensive but also nuanced way at the immensely rich, pervasive and indeed long-lasting contribution of those who were forced to flee from Nazi persecution. Obviously in the first instance Germany and Austria, but way beyond that, including of course Hungary. The huge contribution they made, both in the short and in the longer term, to this country's culture. And the festival took the form of, I have to say, it got bigger than I ever imagined it would. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but it's a tribute to all the tremendous supportive interest and indeed collaborative projects that were made possible by my small idea. It took the form of a year-long nationwide arts festival, straddling all the arts and really straddling also a huge variety of different kinds of venues, big, small, well-known, not so well-known. But the level of sympathetic interest that the idea aroused, I still feel quite humbled by, actually, I have to say, as the child of Jewish refugees from, in my father's case, Poland, my mother's case, German-speaking family from Lithuania. And it still makes me feel proud, but also gratified, and as I say, also rather humbled. Now, the festival itself ran from March 2019 to March 2020, and I don't have to remind you what world events intervened in that month. Luckily, I mean, looking back, how lucky was it that essentially the festival was coming to the end of its year run. And what happened? We had to cancel or postpone just a few events. But actually, what happened as a result of COVID, and I'm sure this isn't news to you anymore, we all had to do it, but we went online. And if you're at all interested, if you look at the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website, or just do a Google search for Insiders Outsiders Festival, you will see the website which has information about past events, but also recordings. There's a YouTube channel, recordings of the ongoing series of online events that I started in June 2020, and that is actually still carrying on. We have quite a lot this very month. This is part of Refugee, or to coincide with this year's UK Refugee Week. But of course, what is wonderful is that we can now revert to events like this, which are what you might call hybrid. They are both in person and also, of course, recorded, live streamed, and available for viewing afterwards. So yes, Bossányi, and perhaps I can also pick up what Mate was saying about Robert Waterhouse's wonderful project. He wrote a book, it's about 3 years ago now, possibly even more, called Their Safe Haven, which is a wonderful repository of information about Hungarian artists who came to this country, and it makes for a fascinating read. And there are plans afoot, I think I'm allowed to say it, to stage an exhibition prompted based on that book, hopefully for next year. It's very much in process at the moment. So yes, Bossányi, I hope I've got that more or less right, the pronunciation. He fits the bill entirely, and I'm very much aware there's a whole kind of story, isn't there, within stories of the Hungarians who often offered each other support in the ways that they could once they were here. And we have a treat, I think, in store, because what we've done is to choose 4 very different speakers coming to the gentleman in question from very different angles. And as Mate said, we need to make sure there's plenty of time for questions, answers, comments at the end, so we'll be sure to do that. What I'd like to do then is introduce each speaker in turn, and then I will obviously step down. We're going to start with a very personal introduction and overview to Ervin Bossányi from his granddaughter. What could be more wonderful than that? And I'd like to start by just saying a few words of introduction about her. I'm going to quote what she herself, the information she's provided. She was born in Northumberland, but lived with her Bossányi grandparents in the 1950s and 60s, after her father, Joe Bossányi, very eminent career as a zoologist, brought them to London. After studying languages, she taught English at a boys' school in West Africa for several years and travelled a great deal, eventually settling in rural southwest France, where she's lucky enough to live to this day. In due course, she became a freelance translator and conference interpreter, specializing in environmental problems from the human sciences perspective. She also set up an association to support performing artists in her area, including organizing music festivals. She's carried on working since she retired, but with more time on her hands, and these are her own words, she's been able to delve more deeply into facets of her fascinating family's history, writing up her father's memoirs. They haven't actually been published yet, or have they? They have. You'll tell us more about that. I've read them in PDF form. And chasing up the, as she puts it, the strange saga of the washerwoman of Chartres, the stained glass window her grandfather made for the Tate Gallery during the war, and I think we're going to be hearing more about that. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Ilona.
Thank you, Monica. And is that all right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is wonderful, and I just wish I could tell my grandfather about it, and indeed my dad, who did a great deal to carry on preserving his father's artistic legacy. Well, that photo, I chose that because that's really how I remember my grandfather when we were living with them. That was taken in 1972 in his studio, and that's how I remember him, with his squeaky hearing aid, which you can see in his pocket there, which he often attached with a large safety pin. He also had a stash of chocolate, which he wasn't allowed to eat, which he kept hidden, but he would let me and my brothers have some from time to time. Anyway, we lived with Opu, that's what we called him, and Omar, our grandmother, from 1957 to about 1961. And I've put this presentation together from my memories and a whole lot of quite interesting family photographs. Well, we knew our grandfather was a bit different to other grandfathers. Our friends' grandfathers weren't anything like him, but anyway, we watched him working, we would see him working, we knew it was important, but we didn't really think about him as an artist. He was au pou. He had hilarious ways of speaking English. I remember there was he made a decorative little wooden panel for the downstairs bathroom, which was shaped like a flower, and on which he wrote, "This toilet, alas, is easily blocked." Anyway, that kind of thing has been handed down in the family. We also knew that things had happened to him which were very important and also very terrible. As children, we didn't really know, but well, as the years went by, we began to understand more of what had happened to him. Well, in Britain, as an artist, he's best known as we said, for the Canterbury Windows there. That was a commission he received, I can't remember exactly, but I remember him working on these windows. That one's called Peace, this one's called Salvation, and you can't perhaps really see, but that one evokes the liberation from the concentration camps. I remember the consecration ceremony at Canterbury Cathedral. I'm not sure which one, I think there may have been more than one. I do remember having tea with the Dean of Canterbury. That's us in the middle there, in the black and white photograph. So all of the windows, in fact all of my grandfather's work, has a very distinctive style, quite stylized, evoking, well, we'd now call it ethnic diversity, I suppose. He had a very sort of humanist, universal perspective on human experience, on religion, and so on. Well, he also made major stained glass windows for Washington, and that's the Woodrow Wilson Memorial. He worked for South Africa during the apartheid time, and was very worried because one of his windows shows two doves, a black one and a white one, and he got rather worried about what might happen to them and made them twice in case they got destroyed, which happened to some of his works he'd left in Germany, in fact. He also made stained glasses for the West End Synagogue in London, the new one, and for Oxbridge Tube Station. I don't know if anybody's seen them, but they're still there. He was also a very prolific painter, but his paintings aren't very well known because he never wanted to sell them. He considered them to be his children. Okay, so briefly about his parents. Now, when his parents married, his father was called Adolf, and his family name at that point wasn't Bossányi at all. He was called Breslauer, except that wasn't really his name either. In fact, my grandfather's grandfather, I think, had fled what's now Ukraine from pogroms there, and they ended up in what's now, a part of southern Hungary, and they didn't have surnames. So they were given by the authorities the name of their village that they said they came from, which was called Bereslava. Anyway, one of them, either that generation or the next one, then Germanized that to Breslauer because it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Adolf was called Breslauer, that was my grandfather's father. But when he married his wife, Ernestine was from a Jewish family in Baja, southwest Hungary. Their family had been there since 16th century, I think. She was called Bossányi. And by then, Hungary was becoming a bit more respectable as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so Adolf decided to Hungaricize his name, and he added a YI at the end of Bossányi, and that's why we're called Bossányi. Adolf died in 1930, so he was spared what was to come. His wife, Ernestine, so my great-grandmother, she was deported to Auschwitz in a mass deportation where all of the Jewish families, and probably the Roma families as well, who were living in Baja at the time, were all deported to Auschwitz in 1943. She was 91. Only one woman from the entire town survived, and nobody knows how my great-grandmother died. And of course nobody knows what happened to the Roma community either. There are no records at all. There are records of the Jewish people who died and didn't come back, but not of the Roma. Well, after the war ended, it fell to my dad to bring the news to Ervin, who was by then living in Eastcote, that his mother had been deported and had never returned. That was something we'd always been aware of as children. One of the things which, well, has coloured a lot of our thoughts about the world since. Well, my grandfather had last seen his mother in 1937, and he'd had no news of the family and friends there since 1943, before she was deported. And the awful news didn't come until the war ended in about 1947. He made this stained glass window in her honour. It's a bit enigmatic, the title, the Latin title, but we think, as it says there, it means that nobody must ever hurt the love, the ties between a mother and child. It always makes me cry. I've got children of my own. It was donated to the V&A in 1955, and I think you can still see it there. Next slide. Right, this is a few scenes of pre-war Baja, Ervin's hometown in southwest Hungary. He took these photographs, and it's always struck me that the composition of the photographs recalls the composition of a lot of his paintings. And I've often thought he would have been a good photographer. He was fascinated by the peasant and Roma communities in his hometown, and they inspired his artwork all his life, stained glass, but also the paintings, especially during the difficult war years in England, when he used to take refuge, I think, in painting the serenity of scenes from his childhood, in close contact with the natural world, with animals, with the simple life of the peasant community. He hoped to return to Hungary after the war ended, and he went to visit in 1951 with Wilma, his wife, and my parents, but he was distressed by the changes. The village life and the communities he'd known there had vanished. Still, the good thing is that I was actually conceived there. Well, he started his artistic career very early, my grandfather. He was 14 when he started at the Budapest Royal National Hungarian School of Applied Arts, where he was studying with his friend Imre Sobotka. Now, I'm mentioning him because the two families, Bossányi and Sobotka, have actually stayed in touch and remained friends ever since. That's through 5 generations, 2 world wars. and different countries, obviously. In fact, I was hoping that Imre Sobotka's granddaughter, Judka, who's a good friend, I was hoping she might be able to come, but she can't, COVID, etc. Ervin won a major travelling scholarship to study art. This was well before the First World War. And he went to Italy, he went to London, he went to Paris, and was much inspired by the prolific artistic innovation that was going on there. He dabbled in Cubism, which he later rejected, partly, I suspect, because he was very, very anti-commercial art. As I said, he never wanted to sell his paintings, and he had great difficulty accepting the idea that art could be a commodity. And for that reason, he used to get very angry about Picasso. Right, well, he'd been born in a Jewish family, my grandfather, but he was never a practicing Jew. He was interested in religion, but he was interested in religion as a universal expression, really, of the human spirit, and was interested in how that expression could be reflected in artistic production. The photographs you see there, oops, can you go back please? The one at the bottom right, that's my grandfather in his military uniform. He got called back to do military service from Paris in 1913. They're self-explanatory. My grandfather in the top, is it right hand photo up there? He's the second from left in the back row. That's his visa, I suppose, when he was studying in Italy. He was in Paris when World War I broke out. And in fact, he'd gone off on a painting trip to Brittany with his friend Imre. But there, both of them were arrested as enemy aliens. That's why I put in the title there, in the wrong place at the wrong time. It so happened, well, he was a Hungarian, and Hungary joined the war on the wrong side, seen from the Allied perspective. And so he became an enemy alien and was arrested and spent 3-4 years in an internment camp. Now his brother, Karoly, who he was very close to, was interned at the same time for the same reasons by the British in the Isle of Man. So the photograph on the left there, that's my grandfather's internment camp, and you can just about see him next to the barrel. That's in Brittany, and the other one there, his brother Karoly, is on the left at the back. And the two of them corresponded, sent each other postcards from their respective internment camps. That's always been something that's amazed me, how well the postal services carried on during the war, First World War, and also the Second World War. I've got a postcard actually at home, which was sent from my mother's father, who was an artist, also in Belgium, who became a refugee in France, to my father's father, who was a refugee from Germany in England. And this postcard travelled for a whole year from place to place across France in the last known address of my maternal grandfather until it finally got back to his place in Belgium. It's absolutely amazing. It's got all the stamps from all the post offices on it. Karoly, my grandfather's brother, was released from his internment camp on the Isle of Man to work on fruit farms in England because there was a labour shortage for obvious reasons. But tragically, he then died during the Spanish flu epidemic. There are kind of echoes in that story resonating up to the present, aren't there? Well, after the war ended, First World War, my grandfather and his co-Hungarians were sent back to Hungary in a sealed train. In other words, they weren't allowed to get off, or nobody was allowed to get on to see them. And they were literally dumped on the Hungarian border because there was no treaty after the war between France and Hungary. Anyway, so they made their way back somehow or other to Budapest, where they were reunited with their families. At that time, there was a short-lived socialist, communist, maybe, experiment in Hungary under Bela Kun. But it was overthrown, this government, after not very long, barely a year, and replaced by, well, a fascist government under Miklos Horthy, which very rapidly began to persecute minorities, Jews, Roma, and others. And my grandfather decided to leave because he felt he would not be able to work at his art in such a climate. He stowed away on a Budapest steamer along the Danube to Vienna, then made his way to Lübeck in eastern Germany. Why Lübeck? He made his way to Lübeck because the man who his brother Károly had studied landscape architecture with, a man called Harry Maas, had invited him to stay at his house. Károly, by the way, I forgot to say, when he was in England, he was actually working with a well-known British landscape architect called Thomas Mawson when he was arrested as an enemy alien. Anyway, back to Ervin. At Harry Maas's house in Lübeck, he met a young woman called Wilma, who was the half-sister of Harry Maas. And they fell in love. And in 1921, they got married at the same time as Ervin was beginning to learn stained glass in a workshop in Lübeck. He was also beginning to get commissions for not only stained glass, because he was very versatile. He was working with ceramics, he was working with wood, he was working even with tapestry, and of course with paint and all kinds of media. Well, he started getting these commissions, and the young couple settled in, next slide please, in that lovely little cottage there, which still exists on the outskirts of Lübeck. It was very nice, but it had no running water, it had no bathroom, but they were really happy there as a young couple. And that's where my father was born. In fact, believe it or not, I am still in touch with the son of the gynecologist who delivered my father in 1924. Such is the strength of family and relationships and friendships in our family. It's absolutely incredible. Wilma was a concert pianist, and she was staying with her half-brother Harry because she was giving a concert there in Lübeck. She was still recovering from the death of her twin brother, who was killed on the Eastern Front in the First World War. Okay, next slide, please, thank you. So, this is in Lübeck. There's my grandfather working on a cubist work, which is being sought because it's one of the lost cubist works which are being researched for a major exhibition in Budapest, by the way, scheduled for next year, of Hungarian cubists. At the top, there's a mural for the City Library in Lübeck. That's an example of the kind of commissions that my grandfather was getting in Germany. He had the good fortune to get to know the city architect in Hamburg, a man called Fritz Schumacher, and who strongly believed, as my grandfather did, that art should be for the many and not for the few, to not coin a phrase, and should be on display for all the public to enjoy, and therefore in public buildings such as schools, libraries, museums, obviously, city squares, and my grandfather made a lot of works for Schumacher on commissions, and really his reputation began to take off. He was getting quite prosperous, in fact. But he was painting still, and there's a portrait of my dad as a baby, which I gave to my daughter when she had my first grandchild. And anyway, I have to say he looks very much like my first grandchild, actually, who's called Nikki. She's a girl. That's my grandmother with my father learning to ride a bike in the tree nursery next to the house where they lived, which was called the Baumschule. That's a tree nursery. Now, I've put that there because I like the costumes. 1920s. Well, my grandfather was doing well, and he moved to Hamburg. And he was doing well enough to be able to commission himself the design for a house for the family, a very modern house, which you can see on the right there. Next slide, please. There, on the right. A very surprisingly modern house, because in later years, my grandfather and my father, they all used to say, oh, don't like modern art, don't like modern architecture. But in those days, well, that was the modern art that he found interesting. So he was getting lots of commissions still, and unfortunately, during the war, when the war broke out, and in its aftermath as well, a great many, nearly all of the works he had created for public buildings in Germany were destroyed, either by Nazi vandalism of Jewish artworks and also by Allied bombing, including after the war. On the right is my very favourite work of all, which unfortunately no longer exists. That's a portal which my grandfather designed for the Heligoland State Biological Institute. Now, I've often wondered whether that was what sent my father into zoology, because the casts there of sea creatures are absolutely wonderful. I love them, and that's what my father went into, marine biology. I asked him, and he said no. So I said, well, why was your father so interested in these creatures? And he said, oh, well, he just loved all of the natural world. Anyway, that was bombed to smithereens by the Allies, because they were afraid that the island of Heligoland would be used as a munitions dump by the Germans after the war. So his career was prospering, the family was happy in Hamburg, my dad was going to school, and so on and so forth, and then came 1933. Can I have the next slide? Right, on the left there, that box there is what my grandfather called his thunder box. The thunder box is a contraction of thunderstorm box, which is a translation of Gewitterkaste, which is a thunderstorm box in Hungarian. Nowadays we'd call that a go bag, I suppose. It's where he kept all his most important documents and some possessions, such as his mother's purse, his ID documents, bits of jewellery. We found this box in my father's affairs after he died last year, and opened it, and that's some of the things that were there, some of the mementos which my grandfather and later my father carried with him all his life. After the election in 1933, Jews were banned from public employment, and the whole family was stripped of their German citizenship, even though my grandmother and my dad were both German by birth, and Ervin had gained German nationality. Well, they fled to the UK on a Hungarian passport by default. And they had to take photographs as part of the photograph on the bottom left there is the one that's in their passport. There was only the one passport, my grandfather's, because women didn't have their own passports in those days, nor did children. Well, in 1933, my grandfather started applying for asylum in different countries because he knew what was coming. He'd had experience already in 1919 in Hungary with the fascist government there. Well, he applied to a number of different countries. They were all rejected. And finally, the British government agreed to host the family, rather reluctantly. They were granted a 3-month visa, provided that none of the family took on any kind of employment. This is 1934, when they were able to leave, well ahead of the worst. My grandfather was able to arrange for crates of glass to be sent over to Britain so that he could carry on working on stained glass. He also brought art materials with him. The Bovril advert there, I've put that there because that's a story that it's another family story. When my grandparents, my father, arrived in Harwich, they got on a train to get to London, where they were expected by a Hungarian friend of theirs. And they wanted to know where the train was going, they wanted to know where they were. And so every time the train stopped, my grandmother and grandfather, they'd look through the window to see, what's this station called? And others too, because they weren't alone as refugees on that train. And then my grandmother spotted that. And she said, I think this station's called Bovril. She said it in German, which I don't know very well. Aha, and apparently there was a Japanese fella sitting next to them, and he was nodding sagely, aha, Bovril. Anyway, the train carried on and stopped at the next station. And that one was called Bovril as well. And so was the next one. Actually, that story, my father discovered exactly the same thing had happened to the mother of Peter Ustinov when she emigrated from Russia many years before. Exactly the same thing. My dad sort of interpreted this as showing that it seemed that in Britain it was more important to put up adverts than to let people know where they were. Well, they landed in Northwood Hills, ended up there, where they were greeted by their Hungarian friends who'd managed to find a bungalow for them to stay in, that one there, which apparently was very drafty, and it was very small, but they were very glad to have somewhere to stay. And my grandfather immediately started looking for commissions. I've put that little photograph at the bottom there. That's the teddy bear and a couple of other toys that my father was able to take with him. And when I saw that photograph, I gasped, because we've still got that teddy bear, which is now, 88 years old. my daughters played with it, and now my granddaughter's playing with it. Anyway, so my grandfather began to look for commissions, but they were officially classified by the UK as aliens, and they had a visa which wouldn't allow them to work. So that was rather difficult. That's where friends and connections came in very, very handy. In fact, absolutely crucial, because without friends, they could never have survived. They had no means of making a livelihood. They weren't exactly poor, because they had left the big house behind in Hamburg, which a sister of my grandmother had managed to rent out, but they couldn't get any, income from it. They weren't allowed to, no money was allowed to come out of Germany, and I'm not quite sure how they survived, actually. They did apply for UK citizenship, which would have allowed them to work, but they had to be resident for 5 years in Britain before being able to get British citizenship. I don't know how people manage. I mean, this is still like that. After 5 years, that would have been 1939, and then the war broke out, and so the whole thing was stalled. So they then spent another, up to 1947, as aliens, although they were by then allowed to work. So friends, again, absolutely critical for their moral support and material as well. Well, his career had been flourishing in Hamburg, but the situation my grandfather found in the UK was very different and came as a shock in terms of artwork and the reception of it. Stained glass in particular was considered to be only for churches, and styles were very codified. You can see from the examples there. Now, he was asked to make a stained glass window for the London Underground station of Uxbridge. Now, he welcomed this because this was a man called Frank Pick, who was heading London Transport at the time, and who had visions of similar to Fritz Schumacher back in Hamburg, of art for the many and not for the few. So he got this commission to make this stained glass in Uxbridge, but his designs were rejected, not once, but twice. And what eventually happened was a sort of compromise, which doesn't look at all really like my grandfather's work. The bottom window there. His first design, with the cows there, was just laughed out of court. It was far too exotic and too rural, and this is typical of my grandfather's work. He loved going back to the pastoral scenes of his youth, and also he made the mistake of thinking that the name Uxbridge was related to oxen going over a bridge, which is why he decided to make a stained glass showing this kind of scene, which was very close to his heart. Anyway, that was rejected. The next one was rejected as well, because it looked too much like Charlie Chaplin's film, remind me, the one with the machines? Anyway, that wasn't approved of either. So, he was having great trouble actually finding commissions and work, and so he was absolutely delighted and very moved when he was asked in 1937 to make a stained glass for the Tate Gallery, which he dedicated to the British public, who had given him refuge from the Nazis. That window wasn't installed until 1948, and it's got a long, convoluted story, which I'll tell you about later, because it's worth telling. Next slide, please. I hope I'm not being too long here. Okay, the war years in London, when my grandparents and my father lived through the Blitz. By then, they'd managed to buy, thanks to a loan from a friend, a house in Eastcote, which is near where they ended up to begin with. £1,000 it cost. I think you'd have to multiply that by, well, I don't know, anyway. We've got very few photographs of the family at that time, because as initially aliens, and then enemy aliens, when Hungary again joined the war on the wrong side, their cameras were confiscated by the British authorities, so we haven't got any photographs, or very few. That one of my father, by the pond, which my grandfather built for him, was taken in 1940, just before the confiscation. As you know, I think most enemy aliens were interned on the Isle of Man. I expect some of you have read The Island of Extraordinary Captives by Simon Parkin, which is all about the internment camps on the Isle of Man. It's absolutely fascinating reading. Well, we don't know why my grandfather's family escaped this internment, because it really was a policy of mass internment of all enemy aliens. Never mind that they were a Jewish family escaping from the Nazis, they were nevertheless enemy aliens. Well, they were evicted from their house in Eastcote at the same time as the confiscation camera, and had to go and live in a caravan with friends, which meant that my grandfather could no longer work on the famous window for the Tate Gallery at the time, which was a great problem, because at that time they had absolutely nothing to live on. They survived with my granddad doing odd jobs, my grandmother giving piano lessons. They had a vegetable garden when they finally got back to their house, and he made a few artworks for friends. He was very much a DIY man, my grandfather. I remember him making all kinds of contraptions. And one of the contraptions he made at that time, he used to go scouring for scrap materials everywhere. Bits of metal, old padlocks, bits of wood, anything that he could use to make things. And he made his own kiln for firing stained glass, which was quite an achievement. That's also how he started making, or maybe developed, his taste for making wooden frames for his paintings. He didn't like frames, or at least he thought that picture frames should be part of the picture's composition, which I entirely agree with, actually. So he used to make his frames himself. He'd paint paintings on bits of old scrap wood, and then he'd use scrap wood to make the frames as well. Well, the studio became a haven, a sanctuary. The studio he built in Eastcote, sanctuary from the war, from money worries and so on, and he used to retreat there, and he painted lots of scenes from, well, his earlier life, when things were clear and simple, but they're sort of, I find them very universal somehow. To me, they evoke somebody talking about exile, human exile, from what makes human life as it should be. Simplicity, harmony with all our fellow creatures, animals, birds, insects, plants, weeds, and other people. The next slide, that's a picture of the studio as it now is, actually. So what happened was that after my grandfather died in 1975, the house was put on the market along with the studio in the garden, and a young couple turned up very interested in it. Unfortunately, they didn't have much money, they were young teachers, but they got into touch with my father and they got on. And my father had a big problem, which was that studio there, because my grandfather never wanted to sell or part from his paintings, was chock full of paintings, archives, stained glass, all kinds of stuff. And my father, well, he just had no idea how he was going to deal with this, all this. And he made an arrangement with the young couple. So I said before, my father and my grandfather, they didn't like money. So my father made an arrangement with this young couple whereby he sold them the house for a ridiculously low price, and in exchange they gave him the use of the studio for as long as it would take to disperse all the artworks. That was supposed to be 5 years. It actually took, what, Alf, about 20 years? And it's still not finished. Okay. So, he now started getting commissions, my grandfather. Oh, I must tell you about the other photos. The one in the middle, that's my grandfather with my mother in 1950. The one there on the right, that's my grandfather with me. He wasn't all that good with small children. A bit terrified. On the bottom right, I don't know if you can see that, but that's a shot of one of the windows. Now, it's still there, and by the way, we're still good friends with the young couple who bought the house, and we're still in it. And I took that photograph a few years ago. I didn't know anything about it, they showed me. My grandfather with one of his stained glass, what are they called, Alf? Cutters. Diamond cutter. Engraved on the window there, and it says, "I love my little Wilma." That's his wife. That's the front of the house, more or less as it is now. So this is during this time now. We're after the war now. Oops, sorry, I'm getting a bit lost. We're after the war, and commissions began to return. I think Alf will be able to tell you a bit more about that later on. He was getting commissions, and the major one he got was for Canterbury Cathedral. During all this time, up until 1948, he was still trying to get the window that he'd been asked to make for the Tate Gallery installed and paid for, which didn't happen. I don't know about the money, but it didn't get installed until 1948, with apparently great reluctance on the part of Tate. So, next slide. This is my memories of living with our Opu and Oma when we lived with them from 1957 to about 63. That's me and my brothers by the pond, which you saw earlier, which my granddad had built for my father in 1940. And that's us in front of the studio with the doves. My grandfather always he loved doves, I think as a symbol of peace. And up down there, that's the garden. As you can see, they never wanted to cut any trees or shrubs down. But it was a great place to play, obviously, for us children. So at that time, while we were living there, our grandfather was working on these major commissions. That was for Canterbury, the Woodrow Wilson Memorial for Washington. There was a huge project for India as well, on which he worked very hard. Unfortunately, it came to nothing because of the political situation with Indian independence. Anyway, he was working on these major works, which is what he's really celebrated for. But what I remember is my grandfather making sculptures in the butter at the breakfast table. He was a good cartoonist, my grandfather, and he could make caricatures of people in the butter dish. I remember the pond and the pigeons and the doves and playing with pieces of glass and a garden full of trees, lots of apples and pears. Also, I remember the smell of my grandmother's coffee and cakes for all the friends who used to come and have long, earnest discussions with my grandparents about art and politics. Yeah, I remember my impatience with it all too when I grew into a 1968 teenager. But it did sort of reach me, listening to adult conversations, including in German. I became very aware of war and violence and dispossession and the effects of all this on my family and other families, and I'd translate these feelings and perceptions into world events of the time. I remember the Algerian War. I remember 1957, a radio broadcast on the Algerian War. I was only 5 at the time. Israel, of course, Suez, I remember all that. And wondering with anguish how I, as a young girl, how would I have experienced persecution, war, exile? And also, I was very worried, and I still am, thinking on which side of all these things chance and circumstance would have put me. How would I have experienced being on one side or the other? Well, those are questions I still wonder about. What I did understand, though, from my life with my grandparents was how vital friendships and family are when you're dispossessed of everything else. Now, I'm sort of finishing here with this picture, which I doubt anybody has ever seen because I only just found it again a year ago. That is a drawing which my grandfather made for my mother in a letter that he sent her in, must have been about 1953. That was when we were living in the northeast. My father was working in the marine biology laboratory in Northumberland, and my mother used to take me on the bus to see the octopus in the marine biology lab. And my grandfather wrote, "Dear Lucy, I really meant to write you a letter, but have only minutes. You know how this special state of mind is. But your letter came and gave my drawing pen a sudden inspiration." And the inspiration is, "Almost unfindable is the octopus," and there it is. And the second picture is the octopus takes off. Anyway, "almost unfindable is the octopus" is something that we say to each other very often at home. "Ooh, almost unfindable is that email I sent you the other day." My grandfather was, as I said before, he really had a good feeling for animals, plants. He really felt them as fellow creatures, and they're everywhere in his art, including in what may be seen as art for churches, synagogues and so on. You always find plants, animals, fruit, vegetables in them, and he loved drawing them. And being surrounded by plants and animals, wild or domestic, was a haven for him from human violence and ugliness, and it was an aspiration to him. And I have to say that, along with seeking out what you might call a spirit of humanity, that sense of the natural world is really his greatest legacy to us, his grandchildren, and I've done my best to pass it on to my own young ones, and so have my brothers. So that's a rather, I hope I haven't been too long. I've got a postscript which I must tell you about. Right, this postscript is about the famous washerwomen of Chartres, women, which he made for the Tate Gallery. Now, how he did that, the woman on the left there, that's Rosika Rothschild. She was Wertheimstein when she was a young girl, and she was a childhood friend of my grandfather's. Now, in Boya, in southwest Hungary. Now, when they fled Germany for England, my grandfather's mother, Ernestine, said to him, "Get in touch with Rosika. She'll help you." Now, Rosika, I must tell you this, is wonderful. As a young girl, she, in about 1905 or something, her family is quite wealthy. She went off on holiday to the Carpathians in the mountains there. And she's staying in a hotel. And in that hotel, she met a young man who was on an expedition as a zoologist to catch a certain kind of flea which only lived on the Carpathian brown bear. Right. It was difficult to catch these fleas because if you killed the bear, the fleas would immediately leave the corpse as soon as it started to cool down. So he'd invented a contraption to catch a bear alive and therefore be able to catch the fleas off it, which he would then study. Now this young zoologist was called, now what was he called? Yes, he was Rogica's husband, he became Rogica's husband, and he was a member of the Rothschild family in Britain. He was part of the scientific and philanthropic artistic Rothschilds in Britain. Anyhow, so Rogica became a member of the Rothschild family in Britain and therefore had a lot of very, very useful connections for my grandfather. It was how he got the commission for the West End Synagogue, for example. And she happened to know the trustees of the Tate Gallery. So she got a contact from my grandfather with those trustees. That was Manson, a man called Charteris as well, who was part of it. And they decided they really wanted him to make a window for the Tate Gallery. And an aperture was provided for it, and my grandfather, absolutely delighted, started work on the window. Well, all was well until a couple of years later, when the trustees changed. And to cut a very long, involved story short, from the time the director of the Tate Gallery changed, the Tate appears to have done everything they could to get rid of the window. I have been working on this for some time now. Lots of people have been making inquiries because the window disappeared from its place at the Tate Britain, as it then was, in 2011. Disappeared after several decades of being in the aperture of the Tate Britain foyer with no label. It was never acknowledged as having been made by my grandfather. And then it disappeared in 2011. And it wasn't until 2018 that it was finally located in 2 crates in the depot that the Tate uses for works it's not exhibiting. I'm not quite sure whether to tell you this now. Maybe I should. I eventually got an appointment with great difficulty to view this window in the store. That was last November, where they were very helpful, I have to say. Once I finally got hold of somebody who would help. They arranged a viewing. I saw the window with Alf here, he might tell you about it. And I then talked to the director of Tate Britain and asked him, well, what are you going to do with it? And he said, well, there's basically, he said, there's no way the Tate is ever going to exhibit it again. I said, well, what does that mean? What will happen to it? Oh, well, it will stay in the depot, where it can never again be seen as a whole work of art, because it's in pieces, and they can't put it up as a whole work of art. So I said, well, what about if another institution might like to have it? And he said, oh, I'll consult with my colleagues. And the upshot of that was that I did have to chase him up, but the Tate Britain, presumably the Tate as a whole, has now given its agreement that if another institution is interested in having this artwork, which is 3.80 meters high and nearly 2 meters wide, so you can't just transport it in the back of a van somewhere, they would not object as long as the contact came through me and as long as they didn't have to make any effort towards this, which I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. Anyhow, so we have the go-ahead to find a new home for the window. And now I'm very happy to tell you that not just 1 month ago, no less, 2 weeks ago, I spoke on the phone to the director of the Hungarian National Museum of Applied Arts, which is where my grandfather first studied back in 1905, who would very much like to have this window, and ironically, they've got an EU grant to have a refurbishment, a major refurbishment, which is imminent, and they would want to make an aperture for that window. So I'm thrilled. I just wish I could tell my granddad, I wish I could tell my dad, because of the awful experience they went through with getting this recognition for this work of art at the Tate, which never came. Anyway, so that's where we are now, and as I've said to others, the problem now is going to be raising money for the transport. So this may be yet another chapter in the saga of this stained glass window, and I think I really need to stop there because I think I've overrun my time. I'm really sorry.
Lovely. Thank you so very much, Ilona. That was absolutely wonderful. It was by turns amusing and intensely touching, as I'm sure the rest of you will agree. With my eye on the clock, I will straight away introduce our next speaker, who, as I already said, is going to come to Bossányi from a very different perspective. Caroline Swash is a stained glass expert, and it will be her job today, in rather condensed fashion, to set his work as a stained glass artist, particularly in this country, in the broader context of work in that medium. And Caroline, before you come up and start talking, let me just say a few words about you by way of introduction. She attended school in Cheltenham in the west of England, was then taught stained glass by her father, Edward Payne, FMGP, the son of the Victorian artist Henry Payne, so the family credentials are clearly stellar. Her first commissions were in Cleveland, Ohio, where she was living at the time, and on returning to England, she made her windows at Goddard and Gibbs Studio in London. Besides making windows, Caroline has had the pleasure of teaching the next generation of glass artists on the postgraduate certificate course at Central St Martin's College of Art and Design from the late 80s until its closure in 2012. These experiences inspired a publishing venture called the Malvern Arts Press. Current titles, current publications include 14 stained glass walks in London, 2001, and the 100 best stained glass sites in London, 2016, and I have a copy if anybody is interested in looking at it later, and very interesting it is too. From 1971 through to 1981, she served as the Honorary Secretary for the British Society of Master Glass Painters and continues her involvement to the present day. Over to you, Caroline. I suggest, yes, come, just hold this fairly close to your lips.
And now just speak like this. Is this about right? I don't have to press anything,
Little
do
bit
I?
closer, you don't
Do I press anything?
No.
No, excellent. Well, first, I have 10 minutes, and I will speed on. Here's Bossányi, early on in his time in London. I'm afraid I don't know precisely when, but the thing I love about it is the nonchalant expression of his legs and the sort of cocky head on one side cheerfulness. I was lucky enough to meet him just a few times, not like Alf, who we knew very well. And he was an absolutely wonderfully ebullient and cheerful and charming person to be with. And this is, next please. This is, I think, what I almost liked, almost more than his windows, with these wonderful paintings. And we've never ever in England, I think, seen enough of them, because they have such warmth. And they're so very different from a lot of what was going on at the time in Britain. And they have this glorious sort of sense of expansiveness and cheerfulness, and tie in with the people I knew who were also refugees when I was living in Dulwich, from Czechoslovakia and others from Hungary, who described the amazing life that they had had in those days in their youth. And it's all here in the paintings. And it's hard to not be able to go back and see it as it was, because it looks so utterly enchanting. Next. Now, here he is, and I couldn't resist, and since Dennis hasn't actually said it, I'm going to jolly well read the bit to you where he describes the inspiration for the Tate window. And he visits Chartres, don't know the date, sorry, but only you probably do, but he's leaning over the side. I've done it myself. You come out of the cathedral, you wander around, you're completely kind of dizzy with the beauty of the stained glass windows, and you, breath of fresh air, lean over a parapet, and there's a river running by, and in that river were, even in the days when I was going round there in the 60s, there were women washing, leaning over, swishing the clothes into the water, wringing them out, chatting to each other. And here is a letter in 1937 written by Bossányi. I stayed in Chartres several days. One morning, I watched the washerwomen in the valley, as they were busily washing, rinsing, wringing, and shaking the clothes. What a wonderful work they achieve, I thought. And yet there is in the cathedral not one window for or from them. But I will make one for them. I would so love to make it. What a wonderful work they achieve. And as I looked up at the spires of the church, it seemed to me that the angel descends to these women and girls and brings them, for their toil, purification and heavenly benediction. So, without knowing, I conceived the window. Next, please. Whoops. Oh dear, it's not that one. Never mind. We've zoomed forward. Help. What order we've got this in. This, I was asked to try to figure out, you know, a kind of cross-section of the people who were more or less working at the time. Now this is Johannes Schreiter, who's had a huge influence on English glass artists in the 1980s and 90s. And really it's the purity of his vision and the clarity of his style, so to speak, that appealed so very greatly. And this is, you can see these in London at the medical school library, it was a church, it is now a library. And Johannes had been very involved with a building in South Germany, which he had thought out, a sort of world vision, and had created. It's the Heiliggeistkirche in Heidelberg, Switzerland. And the works were rejected, and I had seen these and been very, very interested and excited by them, and had asked him to come and lecture with us in London for the Stained Glass Society and my students at Central. And it was so amazing. My husband's a doctor, and he was a professor at London Hospital. I said, well, you know, perhaps, you know, there'll be an opportunity in hospital somewhere. So we went into the church that was about to become a library, and there was a sort of deadly hush. And Johannes said, well, I could give you the first window, if you like. How about medical diagnosis? He said, with a grin at Michael. And we said, well, we'll try and raise the money for it. So from the Heiliggeistkirche vision, we in London got this marvellous series of windows. It took about 20 years to actually make them, as you know, what you were saying about everything taking a long time is oh so true. This, by the way, is the AIDS window, and it shows the, let me get this right for you. I think, yes, here we go. It's the healing process that is being shown here. The HIV strains globally spreading, which you can see on the window to your right, and the continuum of the infection is the white block, and the healing process really is the red arrow, or rather the two red arrows. And what he's done, he had glass specially made, an opaque glass that changes colour in the light. So it has a warm, radiant tone by day while the students are working, and then it has a pure white surface, pure white appearance, and the pink is similarly opaque. So the glass is coloured either glowing or calm all the time. Next, please. This is a very, very different and very dynamic English approach. And it's not a million miles from Bossány's, but it's kind of influenced by abstraction, it's influenced by theatre. This is John Piper, who was the one who linked up his own sketches, his own studies, his own ideas. A lawyer originally, so he had that kind of ruthless, sharp element to his work, and he joined up with Patrick Renshams, whose work is similar but more personal, really. And the two of them created some very, very fine windows. As you can tell, it's strong, transparent colour, not opaque as Johannes's was, and very vibrant and formalised. Next, please. Next. Next. We'll come to the end, have we? Oh, there it is. Jolly good. Ah, now this is very interesting. This is, wait a minute. Could you go back to the one before? Ah, this is David Hillman. Now, he too was a refugee, and a little bit earlier, as you can tell. Here he is working on a portrait, and he had a very competent way of working, grown from the academy schools and also from his own way of seeing. He had a very, very difficult time establishing the kind of balance between his Jewish antecedents, who were rabbis way, way back, so he was expected to behave in the correct manner according to his kin and his religion. And he used, let me just give you what he was doing, Trade Royal County, and he has a window. This is St. John's Wood Synagogue, and it shows the presence of people eating together during Sukkot. So there's this hand. It's astonishingly wonderful work, tucked around the side. So you have this move across from a British academic tradition into this wonderful blues and greys into stained glass. Next, please. Should be in the next, David. Oh yes, here you are. You really must go and see it. This is a same church and a long view of the magnificent series of windows. And he had this passion for detail, loved doing the sort of wonderful intricacy of things and that you had for your rituals and all this kind of thing. He really, really does with great love and beauty. Next, please. Well, there he is, the great Bossányny, and you see again this lovely, oxen going over the bridge. But it's a very, very fine window, and I love the way that Charles Holden is an absolute hero of mine, and he's the most wonderful, lively architect, and we owe to him a lot of very, very fine works. This is one of them, really. And I seem to remember that actually Bossányny did some windows for some of the academic buildings in London. We'll have to talk about this afterwards. I don't think this was the only thing that he did for Frank Pick. So that's as an entering into the concourse, it is simply marvelous, because Bossányny's passion for colour was so great and his understanding of balance was so good that you absolutely can't resist and really enjoy walking under it. Next, please. I don't think that's it. Oh, yes, that it is. I thought it would be quite important and maybe useful to you to realise what was happening after the war in Britain. there was a very strong sense of newness wanted, which is of course what Bossányi himself was chipping into. I mean, he was a new voice, a new set of ideas, very hopeful, so it chimed very much with post-war interest and energy. And these changes of technique were important too. And this is concrete glass, so you could have colour right down the wall, and you could walk through it and past it. And Coventry Cathedral obviously has quite a lot of that as well. This was done by Susan Ashworth for a new post-war church, St. John Chrysostom, which had been destroyed in the Blitz. And these really very fine, very interesting windows. Look at this fabulous colour, which you can jump up and down on in the passage. And that was built by Goddard and Gibbs Studios in London. Next, please. Now, Lawrence Lee, whom you've probably heard of in connection with Coventry Cathedral, because Basil Spence couldn't make up his mind what to do. He wanted stained glass for his new cathedral in Coventry. And he looked at what was going on in England among English glass artists and didn't like it at all. But Lawrence Lee knew that he was doing this, so invited him to come to the Royal College and see some of the work by his students. And two of them attracted his attention. And he gave the commission to them and to Lawrence for the aisle windows of his new Coventry Cathedral building. Interestingly enough, he also designed lettering to go on the floor. And it was all a bit mysterious as to why the lettering would be there until I went to Chartres ages ago now and realised that the light was coming down onto the floor and there was writing on it. Now the whole point about colour flooding the place where you were standing is that if you stood in a certain colour, you felt better. So if you were depressed, you went and stood in the red, which made you more cheerful, and if you were kind of going over the top, you stood in the blue. And that apparently was something that you were supposed to do when you were visiting a cathedral on your pilgrimage. You swished yourself with holy water, you walked in, you looked at the windows, and you read the gospel stories that were in the window, and then you stood for moments in the colour that would suit you. Now Lawrence knew this, and Lawrence was a huge influence. He taught very well in the Royal College, and then when that ceased, he sent people to Tim Lewis in Swansea, and his tradition really carried on with them. He was the most enchanting person to be with, a good poet, and very, very interesting. But you can see that there is a great love of history and a love of detail, and a love really of sort of colour and interestingness of stained glass. Next, please. Actually, we've got to. Next, please. How come here? Not quite. Brian Thomas, Alf and I remember well. And here you're in a rather a different academic realm. And like Bossányi, Brian began as a painter. I think that Piper and Lawrence Lee and certainly Keith New and Geoffrey Clark really, you know, the roots of working with stained glass are paintings. Painting and glass go backwards and forwards together. And it's the colour of glass that's so seducing and marvellous. So Brian, I wasn't able to show you any of his windows, but I felt I must mention him as someone who was working on at the time and who was influential at the time. There was this enormous range of things bubbling along at the same time. And this is the interior of, Lord, where is it? That's right, it's the chapel belonging to, I've forgotten its name, big house, Bishop Tate's Chapel. You'll have to look it up online, or it's in my book. Next, please. I think that might be it. Is it it? Well, oh yes, one other person, John Hayward, and you can see the links. You can see the little bit of the Piper. There's something. There's a sense of storytelling the English are very, very keen on, and so that a memorial will have the a kind of summary of the person's life, which is very, very well suited to a church really, where you have periods of desired contemplation, perhaps desired kind of waiting for something to happen, and you can have that feed in from something visual, which is really very delectable. John is still, I think, very much underestimated, and he did these really rather wonderful windows in Putney, and they're very beautiful work. Next, please. I think that might be it. Yep, that's it. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much, Caroline. An excellent sort of additional element being brought into play. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our third speaker today, Alfred Fisher. Very special contribution because Alfred actually worked with Ervin in a very hands-on sort of way. But let me start again by just saying a few words about Alfred. Alfred Fisher spent his entire life, working life, in the field of stained glass, commencing with the well-known firm of Whitefriars Studios and later becoming their last chief designer. With a partner from Whitefriars, somebody called Peter Archer, he started a new workshop in Hertfordshire known as Chapel Studio in 1973 and continued to design and make windows for a wide range of civic and ecclesiastical situations, from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace. The studio later became closely involved in conservation of important historical glass, and for nearly 20 years he was the National Trust advisor on that subject. He's been retired now for over 20 years, though during that period he has the great pleasure of reintroducing the craft of stained glass to India, which would be an event in itself, but we will restrict ourselves to Bossányi. Over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I've got to take the unusual, of reading my paper because I always forget something.
Alfred, sorry, can you keep the microphone
Right.
close to you?
To start, this is a tale of two deans. You've already heard of Dr. Hewlett Johnson, who commissioned the magnificent windows in Canterbury Cathedral. Dr. Hewlett Johnson was a most unpopular dean at the time. He was a communist, and that didn't go down very well in the 50s and 60s. Are you all right?
Yes, keep this close.
Keep the microphone near your voice.
Right. So there was Dr. Johnson at Canterbury. There was another dean that came into the picture, and he was Dean Dwelly in Liverpool. Now, Dean Dwelly was building a cathedral there. He was halfway through it, and one of the strange things that happened was that I was one of his choir boys, and he was very concerned for his boys, and with a bit of help from him and some encouragement, I managed to scrape into art school. Not with any great ambition to do anything special, I just liked drawing, and that was that. But the dean had become very enthusiastic about Ervin Bossányi. He envisaged that his great new cathedral in Liverpool would contain some Bossányi windows, and Bossányi himself was very, very keen on that. His architect, however, thought otherwise. His architect was Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, and he was of the opinion that any good windows would detract from his gorgeous building. So Bossányi windows were definitely out, and he got what he deserved. Anyway, Bossányi at one time wrote to Dean Dwelly, and he said it was time for him to take an apprentice. And the dean thought of me twiddling my thumbs at art school and suggested I might be interested. So I went down to London, or to Eastcote, to meet the great man, and it was a fascinating day, but it soon became apparent that unlike the medieval apprentice, Ervin just wanted somebody for 2 days a week, and it doesn't take a great mathematician to work out that to move from Liverpool and live on 2 days a week was not possible. But it did sow the seeds of stained glass in my mind, and before long I got a job at the great Whitefriars Stained Glass Studios in Wealdstone, which was only, as it happened, about 4 miles away from the Bossányi studio. So it wasn't very long before I was working at Whitefriars, learning the craft and then moonlighting for the great man in the evenings, which was a wonderful experience because I was learning professionally at Whitefriars and I was learning another aspect of it at Eastcote. While I was enjoying working on the craft so much, it was a while before I appreciated the sheer beauty of his designs. That had to grow on me. What I did appreciate from the start, though, was the sheer warmth and sensitivity of the man himself, and of course Wilma, his wife. There were trees in the front garden that were not particularly well kept, so that once you left the busy main road behind you and closed the gate, you were in a different world. It was a quiet, shady world in the best sense of the word shady. Because of the trees, the house was quite dark, and you soon became accustomed to this and became aware in the living room of the wonderful fabrics on the chairs and on the walls, and the paintings which adorn the walls. The woven fabrics, I believe, were mainly from Hungary, but I could be corrected on that, while the paintings were largely based on Hungarian peasant life, which absorbed him so much, even though they were painted many years later. There was a grand piano in one corner, which Wilma played, while above there was a large suspended flat light shade, one of his creations from the Art Deco period. The atmosphere of this room was very hard to describe, as is the soft aroma which permeated the room, an aroma I've never identified yet. Ilona, you remember?
I certainly do. Yeah.
All in all, there was just a magic in this place and a refuge from the tiny bedsit that occupied a few miles away. In the garden, the trees cut out views of any surrounding property. The studio, as you've seen, was large and box-shaped, with one complete wall and part of another in plate glass. Adjacent to the steps, which you've seen, was a very large cage with perches which housed families of pigeons, which he adored and which knew him well. They were very tame, and he would reach in and take one in his hand, which they seemed to enjoy. His concern for all the natural world was absolutely remarkable. I recall one evening we were sitting on the studio steps taking a break when a large fly lighted on his hand, and instead of swiping it, he admired it and he talked to it, and I was quite astonished. I confess I've done the same thing many times since. Spiders also are particularly friendly, but I do draw the line at slugs. On another occasion, he and Wilma went to stay with my parents in our small tucked-away cottage in North Wales. Surrounded by fields and hills, sheep and cattle, he described it as paradise on earth. I suspect it was their first experience of living in the countryside in decades. Now, in the 30s, he carried out some quite prestigious work, one that we haven't mentioned. I think it was 1933. He made a big window for the Senate House of the University of London, which was actually paid for by the Worshipful Company of Glazers. I have a copy somewhere of the menu for the celebration dinner at the Mansion House, where he was the principal guest. They were served with 9 different courses and 9 different alcoholic beverages. And often wondered how Wilma and Ervin survived that. Mercifully, neither of them drove. Can I have the next picture? Oh no, that's right. Nevertheless, we have to admit he was not warmly accepted by the stained glass fraternity at once, rather like the Tate situation, I suspect. One of the criticisms was that his work was too sentimental. And this image probably explains why he acquired this label for a while. But look at the sheer skills. Oh, that's the portrait. Could you just go back to that, please? Back one. That's it. This shows the sheer exquisiteness of his design. And one vital thing about stained glass, there are 3 main elements to combine. There's the glass, there's the lead that surrounds it, and there's the painted work. And very few artists manage to integrate all 3 together. And this, as you can see, does this absolutely superbly. These elegant doe-eyed figures might have been latched onto by critics at the time, though such criticism has long since subsided. There was no doubt a big influence of Indian art in many of these designs, and I suspect that Hungary's position in the centre of Europe must have a lot to do with this. Next, please. This is a bust done by Paul Sancassiani, and you can see here this has a lot of the character of the man in it. There's a huge difference between being sentimental and being sensitive and caring, for that is what he was to an ultimate degree, and this must be admired. The care and affection he gave to his pigeons was equalled by a love of humanity, something which comes out in his paintings and windows continuously. His figures are not confined to elegant faces and flowing figures. He could show anger and rage in figures at times, for he hated injustice. Working with him was always intense and relaxing, but I remember vividly arriving to work one evening to find him in tears. It was 1956, and many of you know what happened then and the exact date. I asked what on earth had happened, and he said Russia had invaded my country. Of course he was angry at the actions of the Russians, but he had far greater disdain for the United States, whom he said had promised to help if they were invaded, and did absolutely nothing when it happened. My very simplistic knowledge of world politics was changed that night forever. As to working in the studio, I'd arrive home at my bedsit from my day job, grab a bite and pedal off the 4 miles or so to the studio at Eastcote. The contrast between working in the bustle of a workplace of some 25 people and entering the haven of peace of the Bossányi house was extreme. Of course, there was stained glass everywhere in the studio, but so much more. Next, please. I've mentioned the lampshade in the house. This was it. It now sits comfortably in my son's small house in Cardiff. But there are also ceramics, such as this candle holder. Next, please. You've got two, one back, that's it. This candle holder from the 1920s, undoubtedly. Next, and a small carved wooden figure, next, reminiscent of a medieval misericord. Undoubtedly he'd carved it himself. There was a constant exchange of opinions. Mine was very modest opinions. I remember tentatively showing him my very first design that I'd been given by Whitefriars. It was very cool. It was so English. It was grey and it was blue. It had a little bit of colour somewhere. He looked at it for a minute and he said, Alfred, when are you going to use some proper colour? Don't be afraid. I was much bolder with colour from that day on. He had very different techniques which I had to absorb. Some were just a variation between European and British methods, but others were of an individual nature. The studio itself was a marvel of inventiveness. Now the kiln has already been mentioned. Kiln is needed to fire the paint into the surface of the glass, like glaze on ceramics. Kilns were very expensive items, so he built his own, perhaps in the times when he had very little work. It was quite horrendous. It was an electrician's absolute nightmare. There seemed to be wires in all the wrong places, and it was divided into over 20 shelves, each holding one tray on which the glass would be fired. Each shelf had an individual door. That is, if you can call a long steel hinge about this long and about that depth, if you can call that a door. But incredibly, it worked fantastically. And I don't recall any failures which might even be expected now and again with more professional kilns. The line work is copied from the drawing when we start painting the glass, but the shading and textures are inevitably painted against the light in order to judge the effect. This means if you're doing it vertically, moist paint is applied to the glass and it starts running, and you have to dry it by brushing with a delicate patcher until it starts drying. This is a pretty limiting technique. So he devised a table, a glass horizontal table, and this had below it a mirror angled at 45 degrees. This was placed in the window. So on this table, you placed the coloured glass that you'd chosen and were about to paint. and you got a wonderful effect as the light bounced off the mirror and came through and illuminated the glass. And working flat, you could use your paint moist, and it would stay moist for a long time, and you could puddle it, and you could do all sorts of things which you couldn't do in any other method. Also, in his designs, he was very inventive. We used to design in watercolour on paper. He designed some smaller ones on perspex, of which several survive full size. So small windows, he would paint the colour on the back, paint the leads on the front, and that was the design. In Canterbury, it was absolutely amazing because he designed all 4 windows, a small scale, about this big, and he cut the glass for them. He made these designs out of minute pieces of glass, like tiny mosaics. So the design for the window was actually made of glass. So that Hewlett Johnson and his people down in Canterbury knew exactly what they were going to get. So one of my tasks in the early days was to lay out and cut the glass for him to paint. But as my skills at the parent company increased, I was allowed to dare to do some cutting and glazing, which is the assembling of the stained glass into complete panels, and then soldering it. Unlike me, he'd not have the very rigorous training that I had as an apprentice to make a stained glass panel, and then you had to pull it apart. And if you had an unfortunate foreman like mine, you could pull it apart 3 times and start all over again. And that was really hard work. So it's not surprising that he actually admired my skills in the leading and cutting over his own, and I was soon absorbed in doing cutting for him. I soon found that I was contributing this way. I recall doing some lovely little windows for Michael House School in South Africa. But by the time those wonderful windows for Canterbury were ready to cut and fired, he was getting tired, and the glazing and installation of these huge windows was quite beyond him. I had then a family myself and had given up these evening visits, and it was logical for him to have them assembled at Whitefriars, where I worked, only about 4 miles away. So began a marvellous time as I actually delegated myself to transport this glass to and from his studio to Whitefriars for firing. And whenever I went to collect him and his glass, tea with Wilma would be waiting, which combined with a leisurely chat meant that it would be at least an hour gone to bring him and the glass 4 miles. He was so enthralled by the variety of the glass in the stock at Whitefriars when he went there, he became absolutely notorious for returning home clutching the most beautiful pieces of glass from the Whitefriars shelves, to the annoyance of Arthur the foreman, who took to hiding his best glass whenever he knew that Ervin was coming. I heard the expression many times, "That thieving magpie's here again." The exercise must have gone for at least 6 months. I was a sort of junior manager then, so I was able to carry on delegating myself to do this. My bosses became very irritated at the time because it was impossible to leave him once he was in full flow. He had been known to be absent from post for about an hour and a half. Thank you. Next, please. I became more adventurous in my glass work. I progressed to engraved glass and casting and fusing glass. And once I said to him, "Can I borrow one of your castings?" He had some wonderful things that he'd made for Lubeck before the war. And this was a bronze, I think it was. And I took a casting of it and turned this into glass. This is about 1 inch thick. So it's Bossányi in a completely